Most Brits would probably agree that one of UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's few political assets has been his close relationship with US President Donald Trump. However, this week, US-UK relations have apparently taken a downturn after the US suspended the so-called US-UK Tech Prosperity Deal, a package of investments by US big tech firms in the UK, announced in September during Trump's state visit, reportedly due to stalled talks on lowering trade barriers as part of the US-UK trade deal announced back in May. So in this video, we'll cover the US-UK trade deal, why relations are apparently collapsing, and what impact this might have on the UK economy. Who is the most influential person in the world? Each year we ask the audience to rank their top 10 most influential people across politics, media, culture and activism. And now it's time for you to have your say. Click the link in the description to cast your vote for our 2026 ranking. So let's start with a quick recap of what was actually in the US-UK trade deal, which was first announced back in early May. The key thing to understand is that, despite what the fanfare at the time might have implied, it wasn't really a proper trade deal. Trade deals are usually hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. This one was literally 5 pages long, and not even legally binding. Within those 5 pages, there were 6 sections. The first section, and the one that attracted all media attention, was about tariffs. Before the deal, the UK already had some of the lowest tariff rates with the US, having been hit with the minimum 10% tariff on Liberation Day. This was because the Liberation Day tariffs were essentially calculated by using bilateral trade data, and, according to data from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, the UK is actually one of just a few countries with which the US runs a trade surplus. Although we should say here that data from the UK's Office for National Statistics suggests the opposite, largely because the ONS data excludes trade with Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, and financial firms in those Crown dependencies import a lot of services from the US. But while the UK did get the lowest possible tariff rate of 10% on Liberation Day, Trump also imposed an additional 25% tariff on car imports, on top of a pre-existing 2.5% levy, and another 25% tariff on steel and aluminium. These hurt the UK, because while the UK doesn't export that much steel or aluminium to the US, cars are the UK's single biggest export, worth about £9 billion in 2024. Anyway, in this first section of the deal, the US basically agreed to suspend these extra tariffs for the first 100,000 cars exported to the US, and to continue negotiations on the steel and aluminium tariffs. In exchange, the UK agreed to scrap its 20% tariff on US beef imports and scrap tariffs on US ethanol imports for the first 1.4 billion litres. While it wasn't in the actual text, when the deal was revealed in the White House, US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick also said the UK would also buy $10 billion worth of Boeing planes. Now, as we just mentioned, this first section attracted most of the media attention. And that's sort of fair enough, given most of the remaining 5 sections were basically just fluffy pledges. However, Section 2 was about non-tariff barriers, and specifically stated that the two sides would, quote, work together to improve market access for agricultural products. This sparked some panicked headlines that the UK would be forced to lower its food standards to let in American foodstuffs like chlorinated chicken or hormone-injected beef, which isn't a popular idea with either British farmers or British consumers. Long-time TLDR viewers might remember these talking points from back in the Brexit days, when Brexiteers argued that one of the big benefits of Brexit would be that the UK would be able to negotiate a free trade deal with the US. But Remainers retorted that America's powerful agricultural lobby would probably require the UK to match its food standards with the US as a precondition for any deal, prompting successive Tory Prime Ministers to insist otherwise. Anyway, in the days after the deal's announcement, Starmer & Co insisted that chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef were not on the table. They were probably also quietly hoping that Trump would essentially forget about these so-called non-tariff barriers, given the UK isn't exactly a top priority on his rather long to-do list, and his administration seems to have a pretty short attention span. Unfortunately for Starmer, this isn't what's happened. And earlier this week, it was reported that the Trump team had become unhappy at the lack of progress being made with the so-called non-tariff barriers. In reaction, the US has apparently suspended the so-called tech prosperity deal that the two sides signed in September, which basically included a number of pledges by big US tech companies to invest a total of £31 billion in the UK over the next decade or so. This isn't the only place where the much-touted trade deal is falling apart either. Negotiations over a preferential tariff rate for British steel and aluminium exports apparently also collapsed in September after Trump's state visit, which means the only real concession the UK apparently got out of the US was lower tariffs on 100,000 cars. Now, to be honest, this probably won't have much of an effect on the UK economy overall. The trade deal itself was expected to have a negligible effect on GDP, and most of the big investments announced in the tech deal were made by private companies like Microsoft and Google, which means it's not obvious that Trump can just stop them from happening. Even if he did, £31 billion worth of investment over a decade really isn't that much in the context of a £3 trillion economy, and whether or not the UK can actually develop its own tech industry will depend on more structural factors, like making sure the UK has competitive energy prices, which it currently doesn't. But while it might not have that big an impact economically, politically this is pretty rubbish for Starmer. One of Starmer's few selling points is the fact that, at least until recently, he was apparently able to keep Trump on side, despite the fact that most other MAGA heavyweights really don't like the current UK government. Starmer's allies credit the Prime Minister's diplomatic nous for not just the relatively good trade deal the UK got with the US, but also the fact that Trump hasn't totally ditched Ukraine. They claim that Starmer has been instrumental in mending Ukraine's strained relations with Washington, and that, without Starmer's influence, the US might well have ditched Ukraine already. Unfortunately, these resurgent trade tensions, plus the fact that Trump is now suing the BBC for $5 billion, and that he seems pretty set on extricating the US from Ukraine, suggest that Starmer is no longer the Trump whisperer he once was. This comes at a pretty terrible time for the Prime Minister. He's under pressure from his own MPs, leadership contenders are circling, and one of his few selling points, namely his Trump whispering abilities, now seems to have evaporated. Now, as a viewer of TLDR News, we know that you're a details person. So you probably check at least a half dozen reviews by forming an opinion, or making a big ticket purchase. You'd read the nutritional information on cereal boxes. You even read the terms and conditions for some app you almost downloaded. So, when you're giving to charity, why should this be any different? Well, today's sponsor GiveWell provides you with those details as an independent resource for rigorous, transparent research about great giving opportunities. For example, their recent analysis of the effect of cash transfers in poor regions of Africa contains over 300 footnotes, which might satisfy even the most meticulous readers. That's because GiveWell has spent 18 years researching global health and poverty alleviation, and only directs funding to the highest impact opportunities they've found. These are things like preventative medication for malaria. It costs about $7 to provide a child with malaria treatment through the high malaria season. These treatments can reduce the number of malaria infections and, with enough treatments, also save a life in expectation. Over 150,000 donors have already trusted GiveWell to direct more than $2.5 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 300,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And thanks to the donors who chose to sponsor their research, GiveWell doesn't take a cut from your tax-deductible donation to their recommended funds. And if this is your first gift through GiveWell, you can even have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To do so, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout so they know you heard about GiveWell from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.